Hello, and thank you for listening to the History of World War II podcast, episode 479, America's Internment Camps. The surprise attack against the naval vessels at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, shocked the U.S. out of its internal struggle of what course to take as touching the war and forced the people of the nation to ask themselves, what kind of country do they want to be? And as most things with humans, the answer was complicated, nuanced, and at times at odds with itself. With the loss of almost 2,400 military personnel, 6 damaged battleships with 2 destroyed, America's leaders followed the tone set by President Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech and declared war on Japan the next day. But from here, it gets complicated and fear-driven, and few humans are at their best when dominated by their emotions. First, putting aside the sadness of loss of life and loss of military equipment, there was the remaining shock of the Japanese, now the enemy, getting such a large fleet out this far and in secret. And how were their hundreds of planes able to approach Ford Island unopposed? While those questions were being pursued, the, at the time, logical next thought was, if they can hit Pearl, they can hit the American West Coast. Indeed, it would be militarily prudent to do so. And in that frame of mind, the Americans, at all levels, reacted. For example, the Pearl Harbor attack to go that smoothly and to be that successful, there had to be inside help, i.e., people already on the island feeding information to the enemy, which was true enough. And if they were going to attack the U.S. mainland, and why wouldn't they, surely they would have people here too. And those people were assumed to be among the 93,000 Japanese Americans that made up 1% of California's population. To be sure, there was no proof of anything, no sabotaging, no spying or downgrading of communications, but the government, at various levels, recognized that they would benefit from having the people united even in fear, so did little to calm the masses. Indeed, it was the U.S. government that led the way with the initially closing of Japanese language schools. Next, Japanese Americans on the West Coast were ordered to turn in their shortwave radios and cameras. From there, it was the slippery slope of treating Japanese Americans as full-fledged Japanese soldiers, or something very close to that. On January 29, 1942, U.S. Attorney General Francis Biddle established strategic military areas along the West Coast, and within those areas, possible or suspected enemy aliens, a wide but vague net, were to heed the new curfews. In time, these people would be removed completely from the restricted areas, no matter that 2/3 of the affected people were American-born citizens. And with fear still dominating the thinking of shocked Americans, they saw divisions amongst the Japanese Americans. The label Nisei was given to the children of parents who immigrated from Japan, whereas Sensei were the grandchildren of Japanese immigrants. But it was those parents and grandparents from Japan that held on to their language and culture, labeled Issei, that were first suspected of being fifth columnists. And many of these people were not naturalized citizens, thus doubly seen as outsiders. And then came Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942. But in many ways, Order 9066 was the end of a years-long process, not the beginning of a new one. Racism is nothing new, and not new in the U.S., certainly on the West Coast, against Asians in general and the Japanese specifically. Order 9066 authorized the military to exclude any or all persons from areas the U.S. designated as military areas. To be sure, this executive order did not identify any particular group, but as the governor of California would write to FDR privately, "You meant this for the Japs, and that's what we did." Ironically, 9066 did nothing to remove the large Japanese-American population in Hawaii, the very target that had started this all. Firstly, it would have been too costly to remove so many people, and two, it would have crippled the island's economy just when the government needed it to go all out. Under Executive Order 9066 in early March, Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, the head of the military's Western Defense Command, set up two military areas. Military Area 1 was to be made up of the western half of the states of Washington, Oregon, and California, and Area Number 2 covered the rest of the United States. Still in March, the military, using 9066 and Public Law 503, announced that all people of Japanese descent would be removed from Military Area 1. Soon, though, this included the rest of California, which meant about 11,000 people of Japanese descent had to leave the state, or at least the coastline. They were to be evacuated and then interned in government camps, which were either still being built or using existing structures like horse stables. They would be improved, ironically, by the interned people themselves. But going back to the U.S. government, FDR and his military advisors had, for years before the attack on Pearl, been worried about the loyalty of Japanese Americans, which is another form of racism, that those who are different from you can't be trusted or do not have the same loyalty and love that the observer has for their country. So, starting in the late 1930s and early 1940s, the Office of Naval Intelligence kept watch on Japanese communities along the West Coast, and FDR added his might to this by ordering the creation of lists of Japanese Americans in Hawaii to be interned should something untoward happen within the Hawaiian Islands. So the idea of denying freedom of movement had already been established. Congress followed this up in 1940 with the Alien Registration Act that required adult resident aliens to register each year with the government. So when Pearl Harbor was attacked, the government was ready. The FBI and local police were ordered to detain suspicious Japanese aliens, but also some Germans and Italian aliens as well. And the very nature of the Empire of Japan's military successes in Asia made life even harder for the Japanese Americans and aliens in the United States. The fear that drove the racism and the willingness to ignore the law only increased. To be clear, Public Law 503, passed by Congress on March 21, 1942, authorized the federal courts to enforce Order 9066. Basically, the law gave the military the right to make these calls as to what to do with the Japanese Americans over the heads of the Department of Justice. But some questions could only be answered by the President. Next, the military wanted to bar people of Japanese descent, including those who were American citizens, from the West Coast, thereby reducing the chances of sabotage or spying. But the Justice Department thought this was going too far and/or was unnecessary. But again, the news of the cruelty of the Japanese troops in the Philippines, not to mention their overall success, decided the issue. FDR gave in to the military's request. And the American people not of Japanese descent approved in large measure of this, as it made them feel safer. In all, there would be 10 internment camps labeled War Relocation Centers. At first, some families were given time to get their affairs in order before being driven away from their home. This phase did not last long. Soon, the all but named prisoners only were allowed to bring what they could carry. Many lost their savings, their homes, their businesses, bought up by white Americans who knew a good deal when they saw one. For example, a Buick was sold for $25, a refrigerator went for $5. Why? Because no one would offer the owners anything more. Why should they? The interned were first taken to assembly centers for processing, and as bad as some of the housing would be in the camps, these temporary structures were even worse. But once at camp, life was distilled down to its basics. There was shelter of a kind, and food was being brought in. But considering the unknown amount of time that was to be spent here, as in when would the average American trust these people again, more of everything would eventually be needed. Taken from diaries and interviews of those interned, they quickly noticed that only the guards had vehicles, and children were not allowed to have bicycles. And though they were told the camps were to keep them safe, all noticed that the guns the guards held were pointed inward, not outward. And most of these camps were new or used dilapidated structures, but there was no paved roads, so when it rained, planks of wood had to be put down, or else the mud would make your shoes disappear. Like the Jewish or political prisoners within Nazi camps, those inside quickly formed musical groups or put on plays of any kind, anything to relieve the boredom. The guards were not kind and did not want to talk, so little information was gleaned from them, which left speculation. Hence the need to fill the hours and create from whole cloth a sense of purpose. Of the 10 intern camps, there were 2 in Arkansas, and there the authorities let the people grow their own crops. It gave them something to do and took the stress off incoming supplies. Around them, the children played tag, as children in general all over the world enjoy their youth in almost any circumstance. In time, the authorities that be, from the president on down, relaxed a bit from their fever pitch of fear, thinking that many of these Japanese Americans could not be trusted. And in that relaxing atmosphere, the rules of the camps were somewhat relaxed. Camp socials were put on, and the young men and women could dance and spend some time not thinking about their days that drearily looked the same. Other camps started newspapers, but one, they had to be circumspect about what was said of the authorities, and 2, there were never to be any pictures, only drawings, as cameras were still not allowed. The days went by, and the amenities got better, slowly, many built by the inmates themselves. Soon the young men were playing baseball games or volunteering to work outside the camp, sometimes in another state, be it on a farm, a building project, or seasonal work, like bringing in fruits or vegetables before winter. Anything to stay busy. Of course, there was no pay for any of these jobs. It was being done for variety. Yes, the structures were being improved that winter of 42-43, but the drop in temperatures revealed all sorts of shortcomings. Still, the families inside those did the best they could. Of course, some complained, and loudly. Some of these people were arrested and driven away, who knew where. Another year went by, and the inmates dealt with the boredom and repetition as best they could. But then, in February 1943, life was about to change for 30,000 of these 120,000 internees. In late January 1943, FDR announced that Japanese Americans could volunteer for combat duty in the 442nd Combat Team to be the first all-Japanese American military unit. You had to be at least 17 and fill out a questionnaire, and in that form was a minefield. First, you had to declare your full loyalty to the United States. The question went, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign power or organization? In truth, the vast majority of those who filled out these forms were angered by these very questions. They were as American as anyone else and had an American sense of injustice at their current situation. Still, some, for various reasons, did not answer yes to these questions. They answered no. And those would be sent to the Tula Lake Internment Camp in Northern California. As in, the U.S. government believed they now had even firmer grounds to hold these men in detention and to not trust them. The Tula Lake Segregation Center had started out with a much nobler goal. In 1935, during the Great Depression, it was established for vocational training and work relief for young men, known as the Civilian Conservation Corps. But that was then. This was 1943, and it became known as the place for the no-no boys, so called for answering wrong on those two important questions on the government's questionnaire. And with their responses, the government felt they couldn't trust these Japanese-American men, hence the security here was as tight as any real prison. Other men who ended up here were those that would not stop questioning that their rights had been violated and were becoming an irritant. At its peak, this camp held 29,840 men, and many of them were held for 4 years. Despite this rough time in their lives, many of these men would go on to prove not only loyal to the United States, but their love of country and become a part of its culture. Like Bob Matsu, elected to the House of Representatives 13 times, or Pat Morita, best known for the Karate Kid films. He was there as a child with his family. Another actor was George Takei of Star Trek fame. Alongside those just mentioned were poets, academics, other actors, a biochemist who helped research sickle cell anemia, a priest, Tommy Kano, an Olympic gold medalist weightlifter for the United States, civilian rights activists, a judge, and several businesswomen. And it would be the Tule Lake Segregation Center, come concentration camp, that would be the last camp to close in March of 1946. And then there were those who, as Americans, knew they had been wronged and took their government to court. To be sure, there were other Japanese Americans not on the West Coast or near it, and they had not been interned. They were watched and not trusted, but they didn't lose everything, including their freedom. Those who went to court felt good about their chances. But not only does justice work slowly, there was a war on. Gordon Hirabayashi was a student at the University of Washington when 9066 was signed by FDR. From there, a curfew was set for all persons of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast for 8 p.m. But as an American, Gordon believed that the curfew violated his Fifth Amendment rights, so ignored it. He was supposed to be sent to a camp by bus, but he did not show up for that bus either, so additional charges were brought against him. Turning himself into the FBI, he was sentenced to 90 days in prison and then would be sent to the camp. And now that he had been arrested, he challenged the law that he was prosecuted under. Eventually reaching the Supreme Court, it ruled against him unanimously. But it was about to get worse. Gordon was to be jailed in Arizona, but officials could or would not pay for his transportation, so he had to hitchhike to Arizona, to the prison. Gordon would spend a year in federal prison, not just the 90 days, as he had also refused to join the Army. In time, the war would end, and Gordon would be released. From there, he would become a sociologist, eventually at the University of Alberta. He would die in 2012, aged 93. But just after retiring, Gordon got an interesting phone call. Professor Peter Irons of the University of California, San Diego, told Gordon that he had discovered documents that proved the government withheld information from the Supreme Court that showed the relocations of Japanese Americans had no military basis in fact. Hirabayashi challenged his convictions, which went to the Supreme Court. In time, the Court of Appeals of the Ninth Circuit held that both convictions were to be vacated and were invalid. Another victim was Nitsuye Endo, who was a stenographer at the Department of Motor Vehicles in Sacramento, California. After Pearl, she was fired and taken to the Tule Lake Relocation Center with her family. She hired a lawyer who filed a habeas corpus in court. She wanted to be let out of camp to fight for her losing job. The court agreed, but only if she left the West Coast entirely, as the government did not want to fight for Public Law 503 in court. Endo bravely refused the deal, and she stayed in the camp for another 2 years as she fought the charges. But in the end, after those 2 additional years in camp, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the people of Japanese descent cannot be held in confinement without proof of their disloyalty. This allowed Endo and the other detainees to leave the camp and return to their homes along the West Coast. And lastly, there was the 23-year-old Fred Korematsu. Just after Pearl Harbor, he, along with many others, were ordered to report to an internment camp, but Fred refused to leave the West Coast, and he challenged the arrest as a violation of his Fifth Amendment, which limits the government's powers in criminal procedures. But a majority of the Supreme Court justices said that the need to protect the country from espionage by Japan outweighed the rights of Americans of Japanese descent. And within the rulings, the various judges went after each other and showed how much of a conundrum this was, morally, for the country. Justice Black, for the winning side, wrote, Korematsu was not excluded from the military area because of hostility to him or his race, but rather because the properly constituted military authorities decided that the military urgency of the situation demanded that all citizens of Japanese ancestry be segregated from the West Coast during the war against Japan. Whereas 3 justices were against this, and one, Justice Frank Murphy, wrote, the exclusion of Japanese falls into the ugly abyss of racism and resembled the abhorrent and despicable treatment of minority groups by the dictatorial tyrannies which this nation is now pledged to destroy. And in his diaries, Justice Felix Frankfurter reported that Justice Black told the justices as the reason for deferring to the executive branch, somebody must run this war. It is either Roosevelt or us, and we cannot. As for Fred Korematsu, the man, he had been rejected by the U.S. Navy for stomach ulcers after the attack on Pearl when he applied, but he believed it was really due to his Japanese descent. So he became a welder, but lost that job, again due to his race, and this happened with another job. But then came General John L. DeWitt's order for Japanese Americans to leave Military Area Number 1. Fred, in a panic, had plastic surgery to alter his eyelids. He told the people around him that he was of Spanish and Hawaiian descent, but not because he wanted to spy, but because he wanted to work and not have to leave the area that he knew so well. In May 1942, while in hiding, Fred was found and sent to jail. His case was in June 1942, and he posted bail. But upon leaving court, he was taken away by military police and convicted in a federal court in September. Public Law 503 was used, and he was sent to a camp. Now, to be clear, Ex parte Endo, or Nitsue Endo's case, the lady, answered the question about detaining someone for suspected disloyalty for a long time. Korematsu's case questioned the legality of being detained in the first place, but here he lost as well. Korematsu would spend time in several camps, but eventually was released from a camp in Utah. As he was still not allowed to go back to the West Coast, he went to Salt Lake City, Utah. He got a job repairing water tanks, but then found out he was getting paid half of what the white workers were. He complained to his boss, but he was told that he would be arrested again if he didn't stay quiet. And as he was of Japanese descent, it wouldn't take much to justify an arrest. So he left that job. Moving away, Korematsu kept quiet for 3 decades, but he did move back to California in 1949. And the story could have ended there. Korematsu was living his life, and his shame or embarrassment was his burden to carry. But in the early 1980s, lawyer and University of California, San Diego professor Peter Irons again discovered evidence that Charles Fahey, the Solicitor General of the U.S., who represented the government in Korematsu versus U.S. before the Supreme Court, hid reports of the FBI and military intelligence that said Japanese American citizens were not a security risk. On November 10, 1983, Judge Marilyn Hall Patel of U.S. District Court in San Francisco formally vacated the conviction. Korematsu testified before Judge Patel, saying, "I would like to see the government admit they were wrong and do something about it so this will never happen again to any American citizen of any race, creed, or color." He also said, "If anyone should do any pardoning, I should be the one pardoning the government for what they did to the Japanese American people." Fred Korematsu died in California in 2005. Next time, we'll cover some of the experiences of the Japanese American 442nd Combat Team, made up partially of 1,500 men who had been released from the Tule Lake camp and fought for the United States. All the while, their families were forced to remain in captivity. Postscript. President Gerald Ford officially repealed Executive Order 9066 in 1976, and in 1988, Congress issued a formal apology and passed the Civil Liberties Act, awarding $20,000 each to over 80,000 Japanese Americans as reparations for their treatment. Greetings, everyone. So I'm not exaggerating, I've got like 8 books I'm reading about the Eastern Front, trying to gear up because I want to do this right and cover the political and international and not only the military stuff. So anyways, we'll be hitting that soon. The plan is to do one more episode. I've got this awesome resource on some of the men and their activities of the 442nd Combat Team. I just kind of, and again, it will just be a single episode, just kind of touch on what they went through, the irony of America, the American government banning Japanese language schools and then realizing, oh, we need more people who, anyway, so you get the idea. So, and some of their combat experiences, but it won't ruin the wider war when we do get to those in future dates. So anyways, so just one more episode as I gear up behind the scenes, and then we will talk about the calamitous Battle of Moscow for the Axis. Take care, everyone.